So I'm going to do something a little bit old school today, actually, and deliver a talk without slides. I've been experimenting with doing this periodically, and it goes over surprisingly well. It's nice, I think, to have different modes of engagement. Oh, no, that's okay. I'm messing with the camera. And I think some ideas, and these are ideas that are being developed in my forthcoming book, some ideas need to be read and said in a very particular way, with words that are chosen and deliberated over for a very long period of time. So this is the kind of talk that this is. So I hope you'll enjoy it. We'll have time for questions at the end. So the title of my talk is The AI Mirror, Reclaiming Humane Futures in an Age of Machine Thinking, which is also the title of the book that I am desperately trying to finish, and that the pandemic has been desperately trying to prevent me from finishing. So we're locked in a battle here, but I am determined to win. Okay, so what do I mean by the AI mirror? Well, first let's talk about AI just a little bit. For those of you in the audience that may be still a little unsure what we mean when we talk about AI. The accelerating spread of commercially viable artificial intelligence is transforming nearly every economic, cultural, and political domain of human activity, from finance and transportation to healthcare and warfare. AI tools are being used to assess loan risk, identify financial fraud, diagnose cancers, evaluate and rank job applicants, translate texts, discover new drug compounds, and pilot autonomous vehicles and weapons, to name just a few of its most widely known and discussed applications. AI raises a seemingly endless set of questions and challenges for humanity. Scientific and cultural questions, moral and political questions, economic and environmental questions, and theological and existential questions. In my own work, I've focused primarily on the moral questions, but these tend to intersect with all of the others. In today's talk, I want to focus on a metaphor that has commonly been used to describe AI, the metaphor of AI as a mirror. While all metaphors have their limits and points of failure, today I'll talk about how this metaphor is perhaps more apt than we may realize, and for reasons that few of us have considered. I want to talk about what this metaphor means for our own self-understanding. When we model the human mind through the lens of the algorithm, what dimensions of us are revealed and magnified, and which are occluded? What does the metaphor of the AI mirror reveal about AI? And what does it reveal about us? Just as important to consider, what does it conceal? And what is the challenge that the AI mirror reveals for the future of our humanity? A challenge that has little to do with AI's potential to dominate that future and everything to do with our potential to surrender to it. Before raising those questions, much less trying to answer them, it will help to orient ourselves to our present reality and dispel some possible misunderstandings of what we mean by artificial intelligence when we describe today's achievements in this domain. While the concept of animate and intelligent automata can be traced back to antiquity, the history of AI as a legitimate field of research and development dates back to the summer of 1956, when the first scientific conference of that name was held at Dartmouth College in the United States. Of course, there was important work that preceded this, such as the 1950 Alan Turing paper on computing, machinery, and intelligence, and Norbert Wiener's pioneering work on cybernetics in the 1940s. The definition and goalposts for succeeding at creating AI have been contested and constantly shifting since the field's very beginnings. Popular media have conveyed the idea that AI researchers put their faith in something many of you will know as the Turing test, as a criterion for success in developing a genuinely intelligent machine. But in fact, there is no consensus that it represents a fitting goal for AI research, or that it is uniquely meaningful or definitive. And that's a consensus that has not been reached by AI researchers themselves. That is, AI researchers themselves generally do not think of the Turing test as a particularly relevant benchmark for what they're doing, with only a few exceptions. In truth, no single test or benchmark for artificial intelligence has been endorsed by scientific consensus. This has not impeded progress in the AI field. Indeed, years after philosopher John Searle drew a distinction in 1980 between strong AI and weak AI, we have seen scientists begin to entertain the idea of AI as a potentially forked effort, leading to two fundamentally different classes of artifact. The first, corresponding roughly to what Searle meant by strong AI, has come to be known as AGI, or artificial general intelligence, defined loosely by human-level competence across a wide and open-ended range of cognitively demanding activities. AGI is what you envision when you imagine holding a conversation with an android, like Data from Star Trek, or HAL from 2001, or the replicants from Blade Runner. The second class of artifact is the kind of AI system based on recent advances in machine learning that you can converse with or embed in your business plan today. It's come to be known as narrow AI rather than weak AI, because these tools are hardly underpowered. They routinely outmatch human computation in both accuracy and speed on pre-specified and well-constrained tasks, not general tasks, but narrow, well-defined tasks, from image classification to navigation to natural language processing. However, pre-specified and well-constrained remains the barrier to AGI. Humans, even children, can confront a task they've never encountered and make sense of it immediately, without the equivalent of terabytes of training data on the specific problem. Many experts, such as AI researcher Gary Marcus, view data-hungry narrow AI as an impressive field of innovation along a road that heads away from, not nearer to, AGI or general artificial intelligence. Others disagree and believe that with more data and more computing power, today's narrow AI is destined to become tomorrow's AGI. Most recently, the impressive feats of large language models using a deep learning architecture type known as transformers, from OpenAI's GPT-3 and Baillie to the recently media discussed Lambda, have been celebrated by journalists and AI researchers alike, renewing such optimism. These AI models can produce a novel digital painting, essay, or poem in any specified style, expressing virtually any desired content. Recently, the London AI leader DeepMind announced that they had used the same approach to build a new generalist AI agent, Gato, that can perform a diverse range of tasks, from playing video games to captioning images to manipulating blocks with a robot arm. DeepMind research scientist Nando de Freitas proclaimed on social media that Gato heralds the arrival of what has long been the holy grail of AI, AGI. De Freitas does not claim that Gato itself constitutes AGI, but rather that it demonstrates that the current approach of building increasingly massive and computationally powerful transformer models is the right road to that destination. In de Freitas' words, quote, "It's all about scale. The game is over." Gary Marcus, the most vocal, well-known critic of this optimistic view, remains convinced that the road to AGI has already forked and that high-powered machine learning models like Gato, however impressive, are heading in another direction. In a recent blog post, The Road to AI We Can Trust, Marcus proposed a new term for today's generation of narrow AI tools, alt intelligence. Conveniently, we can still abbreviate this as AI, but his aim is to assert a fundamental distinction between what today's AI tools do and what we're after when we seek to push machine intelligence into the realm of human cognitive capabilities, the most important of which, on Marcus's view, and mine, is understanding. Marcus provides multiple examples of what he calls discomprehension in narrow AI models like Baillie, which can, upon command, create a visually impressive picture of an astronaut riding a horse in a photorealistic style, but cannot seem to grasp what is being asked when commanded to depict a red cube on top of a blue cube. Indeed, there's a stark debate going on within the AI community about whether today's large language models can properly be said to understand the images and texts they manipulate and create, much less the world represented by those data, and what would constitute proof of such understanding. Against the backdrop of this debate, which will almost certainly not be resolved anytime soon, allow me to stipulate that if we were to build a machine with a general intelligence and understanding of the world, possessing all the basic capabilities of a mind, the metaphor of the AI mirror would no longer be apt. My talk today is therefore not about the relationship of humanity to AGI. For even if a genuinely intelligent machine were built using human brains as a blueprint, it would not be a mirror of us. It would be more like a copy. A mirror, on the other hand, is not a duplicate, a copy, or an imitation of what it reflects, nor is the image that appears in the mirror. Consider the image that appears in your dressing mirror every morning. The body in the mirror is not a second body taking up space in the world with you. It's not a doppelganger. It's not a pale imitation of you. The mirror body is not a body at all, nor even of a body kind. A mirror produces a reflection of a body, and reflections are not bodies or even body adjacent in the world's ontology. They are their own kind of thing. Today's narrow AI systems are also their own kind of thing, and I hold that the kind of thing they are is nearest in our ontology to a mirror, far nearer in functional terms to mirrors than to other minds. What's a mind? Well, we've got a lot of relevant scientific data about minds and a lot of philosophical intuitions about them. But in terms of a robust scientific definition of mind, we're not much closer today than we were in 1620 when Descartes defined the mind as a thinking thing. On scientific grounds, most of us accept that minds are in some way supervenient on the physical brain. That is, minds are not free-floating intangibles, merely tethered to the body like a pilot to its ship, the metaphor that Descartes invoked. Instead, minds come into existence through the body and its physical operations, especially, but certainly not exclusively, those operations that take place in the brain. Our minds are embodied, rather than simply connected to or inside our bodies. Descartes got closest to the truth when he admitted that our minds are mysteriously intermingled with the body, as unlike the ship's pilot, it's I, not simply my vehicle, who was wounded by an assault. But Descartes could still not accept that the mind is truly of the body, that we move and think as minded bodies and embodied minds. He could not have accepted a reality in which the mind was not only the neurons in my brain and nerves in my fingers, but the hormones flowing in my blood, the neurotransmitters produced by the bacteria in my gut. I do not pilot my body as the trained algorithm autopilots the drone body. I am my body. Indeed, a single trained algorithm can intelligently pilot a swarm of drones or robot bodies. But to think of my mind, my hormones, my nerve signals, neurotransmitter flows and synapses, my brain and gut neurons, as simultaneously animating 100 different physical bodies at once, is to be the victim of a catastrophic category error. This has important implications for the science of AI, which I and others have argued is often led astray by the convenient but wholly unfounded assumption that the relationship between minds and bodies is functionally nearest to the relationship between software and hardware. What is called the computational metaphor for the mind, a metaphor that can be useful and illuminating in limited cases, has also often been inflated into a computational theory of mind, the belief that the mind is literally a computer. There are different ways this has been understood. One popular version holds the mind to be the trained algorithm that the hardware of our bodies runs. The computational theory of mind has sparked fantasies of downloading and uploading human minds into the cloud, into VR worlds, or into robot bodies, enabling the fleshy manacles of human mortality to finally be broken. It's beyond the scope of my talk today to articulate the many sound philosophical and scientific reasons for rejecting this view of the mind as a literal computer. Although, if you're interested in such an account, I can recommend the soon-to-be-published book from Routledge by Joseph Landgrave and Barry Smith called Why Machines Will Never Rule the World, Artificial Intelligence Without Fear. But if we do reject this theory, then it becomes clearer that when we, that is, our embodied minds, enter into relationships with today's so-called intelligent computers, what lies on the other end of that relationship is not another mind, not even an alien mind. And we don't get closer to the truth when we describe it as such, or describe it as a weak mind or a narrow mind. We only further muddy the waters. How should we then describe it? The mirror metaphor is conveniently already a familiar one to us, appearing frequently in explanations of the widespread phenomenon of AI bias and discrimination. For example, it's routinely invoked to account for cases such as Amazon's internal recruitment algorithm several years ago that was scrapped due to its entrenched bias against women applicants, or Google's equally notorious search and image labeling algorithms that have classified black people as gorillas, returned pornographic results when searching for images of black girls, and returned images of black women's natural hairstyles when searching for examples of unprofessional appearance. The explanation always offered for these egregious cases, which is fundamentally correct if simplistic, is that the trained algorithm is not creating or inventing these harms, but simply reflecting them, reflecting unjust human biases. The tool did not independently acquire racist or sexist associations, it was fed them in the form of training data from biased human judgments, learned and amplified those biased patterns during the model training phase, and then later regurgitated them in new machine judgments. Bias in AI is not a computer problem, it's an us problem. This is an example of the virtually universal explanation for all undesirable computer outputs not related to mechanical hardware failure. In all such cases, typically the computer did precisely what we told it to do, just not what we thought we told it to do. Much of software engineering is simply figuring out how to close the gap between these two things. In this way, the AI mirror metaphor is profoundly helpful. It allows us to see that the failings of computer systems and their harmful effects are in fact our failings and our responsibility to remedy. Arguably, the ubiquitous phenomenon of harmful AI bias, which shows up strongly in today's world-leading AI tools like GPT-3, DALL-E, Gato, and Lambda, contributes to the growing tension within the computing community over the need to incorporate robust ethical standards and practices into the science. The problem has simply made untenable the previously attractive illusion that computing is or can be an apolitical and morally neutral scientific endeavor. It also makes it impossible to dismiss the common rhetoric of the privileged that these kinds of bias are edge cases, aberrations, or relics of the past. AI today makes the scale, ubiquity, and structural acceptance of racist, sexist, and other forms of bias against marginalized communities impossible to deny or minimize with a straight face. It's right there in the data, and being endlessly amplified and spit back in our faces by the very tools we celebrate as the apotheosis of rational achievement. The cognitive dissonance this has produced is powerful and instructive. The AI mirror, particularly in the domain of social media algorithms, has revealed other inconvenient truths, such as our penchant for consuming and sharing misinformation as a trade in social capital that's largely immune to fact-checking or corrective information, and our vulnerability through this habit to extreme cultural and political polarization. But while I claim that the metaphor of the AI mirror is both apt, illuminating, and useful, I think we've not yet learned enough from it. Mirrors are ambiguous in their moral and spiritual meaning. On the one hand, they represent a kind of truthfulness that cannot and should not be denied, like the inescapable reality of harmful social bias and unjust exclusion that today's AI forces us to confront. Or the reality of our mortality, like Sylvia Plath's Four-Cornered Little God, which reveals its owner's advancing age without mercy or cruelty, in her words, unmisted by love or dislike. Yet mirrors also present dangers widely recognized in both literature and psychology. The Roman poet Ovid warned us of the fate of Narcissus, who fell in love with his own reflection in the river Styx and died transfixed in place by his own beauty. And psychologists must often help patients with body dysmorphic disorders fight the distortions they see in the mirror. Far from Plath's dispassionately honest little God, the bedroom mirrors of a young girl struggling with anorexia are misted with all of society's dislike of fatness and womanhood. The mirror does not, in fact, offer a full reflection of who we are, nor is it the most privileged and truthful perspective on our being. Mirror images convey no sound, no smell, no depth, no softness, no fear, no hope, no imagination. Mirrors not only reveal us, they distort, occlude, cleave, and flatten us. And if AI today is one of our most powerful mirrors, we need to understand what these darker depths of the mirror mean for our self-understanding and our vision of the future. What a mirror shows to us depends upon what kind of information its properties is fit to receive and reflect. A glass mirror reflects to us only those aspects of the world that can be revealed by visible light, and only those exterior aspects of ourselves upon which the light can fall. The slight asymmetry in my smile, the hunch in my posture from decades of late-night writing and grading, the front tooth I can't remember chipping, the age spots from half-centuries spent in the California sun. The mirror can remind me of all of these. But my lifelong fear of drowning at sea, my oddly juxtaposed love of snorkeling, my ambition to learn one day to read Chinese, my emotionally complicated memories of my childhood, none of these are things that the mirror can reflect. But they are, of course, as real and as central to my identity as what the mirror does show. Even my body is largely occluded by the mirror. Its depth, its heaviness, its smell, its creakiness and strains, its peculiar preference for salt over sugar, these are wholly missing from the phantom in the mirror. What aspects of ourselves, individually and collectively, does the AI mirror bring forward into view, other than our entrenched biases against our own kind? And more importantly, what aspects of ourselves does it leave untouched and unseen? To answer this, it helps to consider the relevant properties of today's AI tools, and more narrowly, what functions for AI as the equivalent of a polished surface, and what functions in a role comparable to refracted light. Today's machine learning models receive and reflect back discrete quantities of data. Data are its only light. Data can originate from and be issued in many forms: still or video images, sound, strings of text, numbers, or other symbols. If the original symbols are analog, they must be converted from their continuously variable form to a digital form involving discrete binary values. One clear question, then, is what aspects of ourselves can, in principle, be faithfully represented as discrete digital data, and which, if any, aspects cannot? A second question is what sources of such data about us, among all those that could exist, actually do exist in sufficient quantities and of sufficient quality to be useful for training AI systems. A third question is what types of data about us that do exist are routinely being transmitted to and processed by today's AI systems. It should be obvious from these questions that I think that much of what is true of ourselves is not representable in digital form with any acceptable degree of fidelity. And furthermore, of what is representable in such form, only a modest subset of that can be generated or stored in sufficient quantity and quality to be useful as AI training data. And finally, that only a subset of that data is actually being used for this purpose. The implication, then, is that what AI systems today can learn about us and reflect back to us is, just as with glass mirrors, only a very partial view. We must also inquire about the surface of the AI mirror, that is, the machine learning and optimization algorithms that determine which features of the incident light, that is, the data that the model is trained on, will be focused and transmitted back to us in the form of the model's outputs. It is the algorithm that determines which of the innumerable possible patterns that can be found within the data will be selected as salient and amplified as a relevant signal for the outputs. It's also important to note that these outputs, while more varied in type than the outputs of a mirror, are still constrained to specific modalities and formats of data transmission. Primarily what machine learning models are used to return are various kinds of predictions or classifications, numerical values, or a binary yes or no, a risk score, a probability, a text label, or a unique identifier, the likely next word in a sentence, or the next move in a game, or a ranked list, for example, of search results or YouTube video recommendations. The recent rise of models like GPT-3 and Baillie now allow these predictions to include complex images or lengthy strings of text or an extended series of commands. Again, what do these properties of the AI mirror's light and its algorithmic surfaces reveal, reinforce, and perpetuate about us? And what do they conceal, diminish, and extinguish? First, what they reveal and reinforce is our belonging to certain categories. Decades ago, in their landmark work, Sorting Things Out, Classification and Its Consequences, Jeffrey Bowker and Susan Lee Starr demonstrated the extent to which, in their words, quote, "To classify is human," end quote. We've been classifying and labeling the world and one another for millennia. But only with the rise of information science and modern capacities of data storage and computational analysis has it seemed possible to produce a comprehensive regime of human classification that would allow every conceivable label for a human being to be matched to every individual human, and for all these labels to be statistically correlated in such a way that the relationships between them can be predicted. In his 2019 book, How We Became Our Data, philosopher Colin Koopman reveals how this dream is rooted in the 20th century creation of a nascent data regime intent on the formatting of the human person as a set of discrete and calculable variables, the invention of what he calls the algorithmic personality. Koopman's historical analysis shows that this dream, born in the first quasi-scientific survey forms filled out by military conscripts to assess their emotional fitness for service, predates commercial AI by nearly a century. But AI represents the hope of this dream's ultimate fulfillment and perfection. 50 years ago, if a prospective employer wanted to know whether you were likely to be a valuable addition to the company, they relied upon a modest pool of data. Your resume or CV with previous employment history, skills, and educational achievements, and at a later stage, the content of your hiring interview and a few reference checks. Today, an AI hiring algorithm can be trained on a vast pool of data exhaust linked to you across multiple domains of activity, purchased from commercial data warehouses that gather information about what kind of items you purchase for your home, what you like to eat and drink, where you've traveled on holiday, the work histories or legal records of your friends and relatives, the medical conditions you've researched online, the movies and TV shows you've downloaded, where you've frequently driven your car or ridden your bike, and the most common words used in your social media posts and those in your social network. The relationships between these data and your fitness for a given job may be spurious and opaque, and the veracity of the data itself highly questionable. But this will not stop an entrepreneurial AI developer from persuading your prospective employer that within this ocean of data hides a treasure that only the algorithm can find. The golden threads of statistical correlation can be woven into a single predictive score, your fitness for the job. Depending on the laws where you live and the resources available, variations of the same sort of algorithmic alchemy can be purchased by your child's school, your bank, your insurance company, your government benefits office, your financial advisor, your prospective romantic dates, and your local police and judges. I spend much of my research time thinking about how and when these algorithmic predictions and profiles are scientifically credible, ethically justifiable, and politically accountable, and when they are not. But that's not what I want to focus on here. I want to ask what it means to our self-understanding and human understanding of one another, that how we appear to ourselves and to one another is increasingly determined by these algorithmic mirrors and their particular style of reflection. It seems to me that I'm far more than my data, and certainly far more than the data that Facebook or Axios or Experian hold about me. It seems to me that you're more than your data as well. But if AI mirrors become the dominant mode in which we see who we are, then by definition, whatever comes under that heading of more will sink further into invisibility. What does that more include? And what do we lose by allowing it to be pushed further into the shadows of our intensifying and expanding luminance of our data trail? One aspect of our humanity that AI mirrors reflect very poorly is the moral meaning of our lives and actions. One of the primary social and commercial risks associated with AI is its insensitivity to moral distinctions and their contextual variability. There simply is no algorithm, no objective function that reliably targets the variables good or evil, or morally permissible, or virtuous or vicious. This is why automated content moderation has not been able to solve the massive problems that social media platforms have with harmful and dangerous content, from child pornography to animal abuse to terrorist propaganda. Attempts to produce AI systems that make reliable moral distinctions by training them with crowdsourced human moral judgments, like the Allen Institute's Delphi project, have been highly instructive failures, to put it gently. This obviously presents developers, users, and regulators of these tools with considerable tasks of ethical risk mitigation and harm reduction. But setting that aside, I want to ask the deeper question of what it means for AI mirrors to become the dominant surface in which we see ourselves and one another, when these mirrors either dangerously distort or block the reflection of the moral qualities of our being. Because the algorithms themselves have no moral intelligence or discernment, the developers of these mirrors must rely heavily on hard-coded filters to block potentially harmful outputs, but these rigid and coarse-grained filters block far more than racist screeds and pornographic images. As has been widely documented, they routinely also block thoughtful discussions of the Holocaust. They prevent supportive community resources being shared among rape victims or sexual minorities. They suppress reporting about the horrors of slavery and human trafficking, and they silence redemptive confessions by former white supremacists. The filters fitted to these mirrors flatten and denude the moral topology of our culture, even as their gaps allow stray rays of extreme moral horror to be amplified and spread across the internet. The result is an extreme distortion and de-rationalization of the moral landscape, an image of our humanity arbitrarily sanitized and polluted. How can we then come together to make moral sense of our greatest human challenges, whether they are the challenges of democratic integrity, climate devastation, global public health, food insecurity, or polarizing economic inequality, when the moral topography of our world is so routinely fractured by the mirrors we increasingly rely on to show us to ourselves? Another dimension of ourselves the AI mirror includes is human spontaneity and adaptability, our profound potential for change. What predictive AI mirrors do is try to predict our futures from the past. Your past, but more importantly, the past of others like you. If the user of the algorithm wants to know whether you're going to flourish at university and graduate in a timely manner, the prediction generated will draw entirely on how well students in the past, whose data trails resemble yours today, fared in their studies. Anything that's new in your life or mind, any resolve or commitment or inspiration or ambition that has recently germinated without leaving a trail in your data exhaust is invisible to the algorithmic mirror. It will predict that it will be predicted you will be in the future essentially who you have been, or more precisely what people very much like you have been. But what you could be, what sudden transformations or rebirths or renewals are possible for you and for all of us, these lie in the dark shadows beyond the penumbra of the AI mirror. The AI mirror does not know the meaning of epiphany. What will come of us when we've looked in the AI mirror so long that we no longer know? AI mirrors are, for this reason, profoundly conservative seers. That is, they literally conserve the patterns of the past and extend them into our futures. This is harmful for obvious and well-documented reasons, from historical policing data used to train AI predictive policing tools that create runaway algorithmic feedback loops, ensuring that minority neighborhoods continue to be over-policed and therefore over-represented in crime statistics that feed the algorithm anew, to a patient risk algorithm used by hospitals in the United States that detected and then perpetuated the historical medical neglect of Black patients. The conservative nature of AI mirrors not only pushes our past failures into our present and future, it makes these tools brittle and prone to rare but potentially spectacular failures. AI systems trained on large amounts of data can predict very subtle historical patterns, but there has to be a pattern there to find. They cannot predict what is known as the black swan event, the change with no precedent, the coming together of history in a radically new configuration. Of course, we can't predict black swans either, but we do know of their possibility, and we can learn well from the sudden twists and turns of history, as well as its straight and well-traveled ruts. What we can learn is the need for resilience and adaptability in the face of ineradicable and unquantifiable uncertainty, a lesson not taught by machines that promise to reduce uncertainty to a finite expectation of predictive variance. We also learn from the anti-patterns in history that we're beings for which there is always hope, that even a disastrous path that we have long been traveling can be departed, that as Saul in Damascus, our sight can be dazzled by a new voice, and by the touch of another, the scales can be caused to fall from our eyes. These kinds of possibilities, too, are included by the AI mirrors now being used to project our futures. How do we ensure that we do not forget them? The AI mirror is also like the glass mirror in another way, insofar as it can only reveal us as we appear to the world outside our minds. Through the lens of recorded data, the AI mirror can know ever finer-grained details of our behaviors, but nothing of our motives. It can know the thoughts we speak, but not those we hold to ourselves, nor those we quietly pass to one another in silent glances. It can detect and measure our smiles and grimaces, but not the true sentiments that animate them. It can find in a nanosecond the song that speaks to me, but nothing of what it says. AI mirrors primarily tell human stories of movement, speech, transaction, and consumption. These are important stories to tell, and we can learn much from studying them in the AI mirror. But humans are far more than speakers and travelers and consumers, and it is essential that we do not lose sight of this. Much of what's hidden from AI's view lies in the realm of first-person experience of the world, what philosophers have called the subjective consciousness, what it is like for you to be seeing this room, listening to these words, or holding that phone. Our lived experience is not, as early 20th century philosopher Edmund Husserl observed, a realm of fantasy or illusion. It's in fact our first and most immediate encounter with what we call evidence. Every other kind of testimony to what is real in this world is constructed on and validated by the resources of this original evidentiary foundation. Nor is this a solipsistic realm closed off to others. My lived world has always been shared with and animated by the touch and looks of others. As Levinas wrote in Totality and Infinity, in meeting the gaze of the other, I do not enter into a relation between two visible objects, nor can the other be incorporated into my own private mental realm. Rather, the uniqueness and radical difference of lived perspective that emanates from the other's gaze pulls me out of the illusion of self-possession and into responsibility. As Levinas says, quote, in the eyes that look at me, there shines the whole of humanity. And in this gaze that holds me at a distance from myself, that gaze of which the AI mirror can see or say nothing, I am confronted with the original call to justice. Yet it's possible to look at another without seeing, to evade the other's gaze and refuse to hear the call. We do this, of course, whenever we pass an unhoused person on the street while hurrying our step and looking just over the person's head. But we do this with one another in 1,000 other ways and moments. Levinas tells us that we live in a time, quote, where no being looks at the face of the other, end quote. He wrote this in 1961. Long before we had a TikTok feed on our phones to deflect and mediate the gaze of our dinner companions, and long before AI mirrors converted the meaning of a human face to the algorithmic calculation of a uniquely identifying biometric vector in a face print. Our detachment from the world's incessant and overwhelming calls to justice is nothing new, but the AI mirror threatens to engrave it even deeper into our way of being. All of us in this room share a kind of knowledge that the AI mirror cannot. What it's like to be a human alive, bearing and helping others bear the lifelong weight of mortal flesh and a curious, creative, and endlessly anxious mind. Much of the time we push that intimate, sometimes comforting, sometimes discomforting, and always morally obligating knowledge aside. Instead, we treat each other largely as objects of expedience, items to be classified, labeled, counted, coordinated, ranked, distributed, manipulated, or exploited. What Martin Heidegger called the view of ourselves and our fellows as standing reserve. But we retain the power to meet each other's gaze and to know one another as human. How AI systems see us and how the AI ecosystem represents us through these mirrors is not how we see each other in these intermittent and rare moments of solidarity. To an AI model, I am a cluster of differently weighted variables that project a mathematical vector through a predefined possibility space terminating in a prediction. To an AI developer, I am an item in the training data or the test data. To an AI deployer, I am an instance in the normal distribution or I am an edge case. To a judge looking at an AI pretrial detention algorithm, I am a risk score. To an urban designer of new roads for autonomous vehicles, I am an erratic obstacle to be kept outside the safe and predictable machine envelope. To an Amazon factory AI, I am a very poorly optimized box delivery mechanism. When we are then asked to accept care from a robot rather than a human, when we're denied a life-changing opportunity by an algorithm, when we read a college application essay written for the candidate by GPT-3, we have to realize what in that transaction, however efficient it might be and however well it might scale, has fallen into the gap between our lived humanity and the AI mirror, and what has been lost in that fall. What might we do then to recover those dimensions of ourselves invisible to the AI mirror? Here we might distinguish between two kinds of remedies. The first involves building better mirrors. When a glass mirror is used for a task that has weightier consequences of failure than our ordinary duties of self-inspection, the mirror must be built with greater care and effort and with more advanced production techniques. The mirrors used for the largest space telescopes in orbit must be fitted together in geometrically exacting molds and polished by special chemical and mechanical techniques to within 25 nanometers of variance from the parabolic ideal. Sorry, you can tell it's been a long week. Might more advanced techniques of AI research and development produce equivalent gains in the function of AI mirrors, such that they can reveal more fully and faithfully who we are? To some extent, this is what's already happening with efforts to create more rigorous standards and benchmarks for algorithmic fairness testing, more diverse and inclusive bodies of training data, more reliable tools for making AI-generated predictions explainable or interpretable, and more robust regimes of post-deployment algorithmic auditing to find the harmful distortions and unexpected occlusions that persist in these mirrors, even when we develop them with care, rigor, and integrity. There are limits, however, hard limits, to the path of building better, more encompassing AI mirrors, at least for narrow AI built in the way that's delivering the greatest commercial and scientific benefits today. An algorithmic pattern discriminator that has no body to burst with energy or ache with age, no despair or ennui to assuage, no dreams to pursue, no calls for justice to make or answer, no secrets to hold or share, no hopes or fears to express in song or dance, no larger purpose to find in service or solidarity with others, can never know very much about who or what I am or we are. But we need this knowledge, and not just of ourselves, but even more so of our shared human reality and potential. In the words of Confucius, quote, "Grieve not that people do not know you. Grieve that you do not know people." Quote. We all know that the future for the human family is going to be rough going for a while. And for this reason, it's an existential necessity, the most vital task, that we not only hold on to, but enlarge the knowledge of who we are and what we can do. Let us then go ahead and build more inclusive, more reliable, and more faithful AI mirrors, and use them happily for those good purposes that no other or better tool can serve. But let us also be wary of refitting our homes, our workplaces, our courtrooms, public squares, and civic meeting spaces as endless halls of AI mirrors, where, like Narcissus, our captivation by their dazzling, narrow light might hold us fixed in the endless present of a reflected past, surrendering the uncharted futures we might yet build for ourselves and one another. Thank you. So I think we have some time for questions. Yeah, 12 minutes. That's good. That'll work. If you have questions written on cards, please hold them up and someone will grab them and read them. But if you'd like to just ask your question, feel free to just put up a hand as well. Sure.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting, especially the difference between AGI and narrow AI. What percentage of AI would you categorize as AGI versus narrow AI today?
0 and 100, respectively.
Then, that being the case, my experience with AI has deteriorated. I call it machine unlearning, and this is with the voice assistants, Amazon, the Google, and to a lesser extent the Microsoft, but they've actually gotten worse.
Yeah, I've actually heard some people. That's a really good question. I don't have the answer to that, but I have heard anecdotal reports of a similar sort. Maybe someone else can speak to that, but we might want to.
Especially true with Amazon.
Yeah. But I don't have knowledge of the particular cause of that, but I think it's an interesting phenomenon. Another question, yes.
Could you possibly clarify your way of defining, or maybe there is a standard definition I'm just not aware of artificial intelligence? How do you define it?
I don't have a standard definition because there is no, as I said, scientific consensus on what the definition would be or what the benchmark would be for satisfying that definition. Now, we do have a pretty good working definition of narrow AI, which is that it's something that can approach or exceed human-level competence in a well-defined and well-constrained cognitive task, where cognitive can mean a lot of different things, from a perceptual task to a natural language processing task to a robotic mechanical manipulation task, right? So that's a good definition of narrow AI. AGI is a little bit harder to define because it requires that you know what you mean by the word intelligence, because AGI is referring to intelligence in something much closer to the word we use when we describe our own intelligence. So when we talk about narrow AI, that word intelligence should be in scare quotes, right? The cat's out of the, or the horses have left the barn, as it were, when it comes to renaming it. But for years, even IBM wanted to rename AI augmented intelligence because they knew that AI, in the strong sense, wasn't what these systems were doing. So it's easier to define because actually the word intelligence in narrow AI is just a placeholder. It's just a convenient label that we've been using for a while, so we stick with it. But it's not intelligence in any robust or comprehensive sense. When we want to define AI in the strong sense, or AGI, it gets harder because the concept of intelligence is a hot mess, as the kids say. It is not a well-defined concept. It has no sort of rigorous scientific theory behind it. It has a very dubious history linked to eugenics and race science. And the best, most charitable view of the term intelligence is that it's a composite term that refers to a large number of different cognitive, perceptual, and moral capabilities, as well as kinetic capabilities that probably are distributed throughout our bodies in many diverse ways by diverse mechanisms. So it's a bundled term. It's a bucket that we've thrown a lot of different things into. So to then define what it would be for machines to do that, to have the same bucket, is probably scientifically a just confused idea in the first place. So there's a lot of philosophical work that's done on what would count as true machine intelligence that wouldn't necessarily have to mirror human intelligence, that would be an alien intelligence, for example. So I won't go into that, but I think you would have to redefine machine intelligence on its own terms, just as we're learning that creatures like octopi have intelligence, but it's not something that we could compare against human intelligence, because octopi have very different bodies, very different social lives, very different physical environments, and thus the intelligence they've developed for those contexts is incredibly impressive, but there's no way to put it on the same scale with ours. The same perhaps would be true of a machine intelligence, but I won't speculate on that. Okay, yes, back here. Yes, is it Tina?
Thank you.
Capture your question.
Hi, I'm Ting, by the way. Thank you so much for the great talk. And I have been thinking about the analogy of mirror. And I totally agree with your point about there's a gap between like the mirror that AI represent and human being. But I'm also like thinking about this analogy together with the last panel about diversity and inclusion. So I've been thinking that maybe another problem like to the current AI is that the kind of mirror it represents or it reflects is not. So we have to think about what kind of representation that we want the mirror to reflect.
Yes.
So like the different mirrors, some of the mirror, they kind of enlarge some part of us, and some mirror are like distorted in certain way. And I wonder like whether you can like whether you have some thought like in elaborating that point and about like even if so. Other than the gap between the mirror representation and us, but if we're just focusing on the kind of representation that mirror reflects, what kind of mirror, what kind of reflection that we want to build? Thank you.
That's a great point. Great question. And I'll borrow from work that very many of us in the AI ethics community have built on for years by people like Rua Benjamin, Joy Boyle-Amwini, Anna Loren Hoffman, pointing out the limitations of a discourse that focuses on, if you will, the mirror part of my analogy, but leaves what's being reflected intact. So one of the worries about AI fairness programs, for example, that seek to ameliorate the unjust biases and discriminatory potential of machine learning algorithms, one worry is that by tinkering with the systems in such a way that we at least blunt the worst harms of those kinds of outputs. What we're doing is giving ourselves an excuse to fix technology rather than fix society and ourselves. So the example I used to give in a much older talk is I used to talk about the fact, I used to use the AI mirror analogy in this way and say, if you look in the mirror and you see a bunch of dirt on your face, what do you do next? Do you try scrubbing the mirror? No, you get the dirt off your face, right? But I feel like some of our AI ethics efforts, well-meaning as they may be, and actually practically necessary in some cases, because if the systems are already in operation, right, you do have to, in a sense, try to scrub the mirror. Right. But we cannot simply let that be the dominant and response, especially if it takes away from our focus on getting the dirt off our face.
That's great. Yeah. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Larry.
Shannon, what?
Can I give you that?
Sure. Although I have a pretty loud voice. What, if any, are the differences and similarities between AI's reflection of me, Susan, you as an individual, and AI's reflection of some kind of collective us, a citizen of the United States, a resident of California, a resident of San Francisco, or some other collective sense? And I'm curious about the possible differences and similarities between the two.
Yeah. It's a great question. It depends entirely on the algorithm. So one of the problems with AI, and even the way I speak about it in a context like this, is it might lend itself to the view that AI is sort of one thing, or that AI has a kind of single model of who we are, when in fact each machine learning model is based upon its own body of training data that is curated and selected and labeled by its developers with a particular goal in mind. And so there are some algorithms, like the recommender algorithm in your Netflix or Twitter account, that are basically looking specifically at data that you have generated, but also data that people like you, in some relevant sense that's been identified, right, are making, and then using that to create a recommendation that's intended to be personalized for you or the kind of person that it thinks you are. And that's very different from the kind of algorithm that might be used to draw more widely scalable solutions for a broad population. The problem is even those are based on a limited set of training data. So for example, think about Google Translate, right? To my knowledge, there's nothing in the Google Translate algorithm, and I don't know anything about this, so this is speculation. To my knowledge, there's nothing in Google Translate that's taking anything from your sort of personal search history or anything to try to give you translations that are specific to you, the way Netflix might. I might be wrong about that, but to my knowledge, it's not. But it's nevertheless the case that the training data for Google Search or Google Translate is not representative of all the languages spoken on Earth, or even the most common languages spoken on Earth by the most people. It's overwhelmingly biased towards the English language, which is not the most common language spoken on the planet, despite our perhaps biased perceptions of that often. And so even when it's trying to represent the generic human, it's not doing an accurate job of that. So I hope that answers your question. Before we take the next question, I think Marion was next. Are there any questions we need to, is someone monitoring the questions on Zoom? If there's anything we need, you'll let me know if there's anything we need to answer. Marion.
Well, thank you so much. That was incredibly evocative. I can't wait to read the full book, but can't wait to read the full book. But my question is, it sounded like what you were saying. I really appreciated when you said at the end that it was that there's a role, there is a potential role for AI mirrors as a kind of tool, but that they miss but they aren't kind of they shouldn't be the only way that we understand ourselves and see the world and or solve problems. Maybe in specific instances when we have a specific goal, there can be a role that they can play. And it seems to me that that's kind of one of the arguments is, or perhaps kind of underlying that is this idea that we have come to see them, or there's the possibility that we could come to see them as much, much more than simply a tool, than a technology, that they are somehow some kind of insight into, into like who we are and intelligence and our future. And I'm curious if, in doing this research, if you saw whether there were any parallels in any other types of kind of technologies, tools that have then come to take this kind of outsized role and kind of risk our kind of collective understandings of who we are. Is there something like particular you think about what we call AI today, like these kind of digital algorithmic?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first technology to do this is writing, right? And the minute we began to write and document in an enduring way our own narratives, we began to reflect ourselves back to ourselves in cultural artifacts, books, and then plays and poems and films and all. And so all of these kinds of information and communication technologies that involve the production of certain kinds of images of the human person, I think would be predecessors of this function of the AI mirror. I remember the way that people used to talk. I'm old enough to remember when people were still sort of upset about how television functioned as a distorting mirror of people, and that we had all kinds of debates. For example, in the United States in the 1950s and 60s about representation on TV, right? And when the first Black families were represented on television, and then when they were represented not as side characters but as the center of their own stories, right? These debates, we often think that all these things we're seeing with AI are just kind of these novel phenomena or challenges that we are facing for the first time. And it's amazing how ahistorical the AI ethics literature can sometimes be. And I'm not a historian, but I'm often just screaming for historians to just please help us, because the missing historical perspective is a tremendous loss. But despite the fact that there are clear precedents, we have to recognize that AI does bring new challenges, not in a sort of unprecedented sense, but in the sense that they're harder now, they're more complex, they're operating faster, they're operating at much greater scales. They're much less centralized, right? There's so many complications with the way that AI is mirroring us that the challenges look very new for good reasons. But I still think we can learn much from understanding how we've dealt with slower and less complicated versions of these mirrors. Yes.
Yeah.
And sorry, we're 3 minutes over time, so this will be the last question.
Okay. So a quick comment and a question. The comment is, I really like how you, I like how you outline the dimensions that the mirror of AI misses, talking about morality, spontaneity, and other things. I would suggest, in addition to that, even things within mathematics and logic. So there's really great theorems from Gödel and Tarski that kind of outline ways in which even mathematics and logic themselves are non-computational.
Yeah.
So that would be another great avenue
of
exploring things. And then the question is, do you think there are theoretical limits to how good of a mirror we can create, even if we move beyond a computational approach to AI?
I don't know. That's a convenient answer for being out of time, but it's genuine. I actually don't. I tend to try to stay in my lane and try not to make theoretical predictions about where computer science can go, unless I feel like I have a really solid philosophical ground for that argument that reaches legitimately into the space of computing theory, for example. So I'm optimistic that we won't have AGI in my lifetime. I'm pretty optimistic we won't have it in this century. I try not to speculate beyond that. But I do agree with Gary Marcus that we won't get it by just pushing harder on the levers that we're pushing today. That we're going to have to bring some novel theoretical approaches or bring back some older theoretical approaches and hybridize them with the current ones. So there's a lot of debate within the AI community about which might be successful. All right, thank you very much. Brian, we're